Hey everybody, this is Brian with Bear Cards 34. Today I'm doing a VR video response for the channel Zach and Porter, one of my very favorite channels, and they just reached 400 subscribers recently. Congrats for 400. If you are not already subscribed, I highly recommend you give their channel a look, and I think you'll really enjoy their channel as well. Big times Bears fans, Chicago White Sox fans, but they love the history of the games, they love the players, they love the cards, and it's really great to see that father-son duo. I think they're awesome. So shout out to Zach and Porter, congrats on 400 subs, and their VR, and I'll include a link to their video if you guys want to check it out. But it's basically the question being posed is who influenced or inspired you to collect? And I thought about that, and I've already kind of done my origin story with the, if you look over here, the Howie Long 1987 Topps card. This is the actual card. It's definitely not in the greatest of shape, but this is my very first football card that I ever owned, and it was given to me by my brother. And so that's what got me started with collecting football cards. So a big influence to me for collecting was my brother, who is 2 years younger than I am, but he bought a box of cards when he was out shopping with my dad. He came home, he opened it up, and so a big influence for me was my brother by buying that box of cards. Now I also included here a Garbage Pail Kid card, because prior to collecting football cards, I would say that was the very first thing I ever collected as a collection, like knowing that the cards were numbered and trying to complete the set and trying to have all the cards. I think the first couple packs I opened, I probably just peeled off the stickers and stuck them all over the place. But eventually I started realizing these were kind of fun to collect, and so I started buying these, and I remember I think they were a quarter, and when I lived in Salt Lake City, there was a gas station called Top Stop, and my mom would take my brother and I there, and she would always get a soda, and we'd go in there and we'd be scrounging up all of our money, all of our change to buy a pack or two or three of Garbage Pail Kids. And we had fun opening and collecting those. So that was my first real collection. Prior to that, I had been all about He-Man, G.I. Joe, Star Wars figures, a little bit of Transformers, but those were not really collections so much as it was just I'd love to play with them. So the first thing I ever really collected, I would say, was Garbage Pail Kids. And then, my brother buying that 1987 box of Topps football cards, and he gave me that Howie Long. And I would say another thing that inspired me to collect were some of the cards I saw him get in that box. And so I'm going to give a shout out to literally the entire Chicago Bears team set. When I was watching this and seeing him get these cards, like Walter Payton, my all-time favorite player, and all these guys, other than Doug Flutie, every one of these guys from 87 was on that Super Bowl winning team of Super Bowl 20. This is back before Plan B free agency, where, you see players moving teams every couple of years or even more frequently. And, this one was one of my favorites, too, was the second year William Perry. So this is 2 years after they won the Super Bowl, but all these guys that I loved and cheered for and watched in the Super Bowl, just seeing all these cards that my brother was picking up in the boxes. And I don't know that he got the entire team set in the box, but you can kind of get the idea there, seeing all of these players that I had just loved and adored for a handful of years, and to see these cards, I just thought, man, I want to get those. And so that kind of kicked it off. So my brother was a big inspiration for me, but I would also say there were three other people in my family that were also an inspiration to collecting, and that would be my grandma on my mom's side. We called her Grandma B, and then my mom and my dad. Now, for the three of them, it wasn't about collecting football cards or sports cards at all. I mean, man, I wish my dad had collected sports cards growing up, or my grandfather. But there was none of that. My dad was from a little farming town in Utah, grew up with his dad being a farmer, and then he went off to college, went into Salt Lake City, and did his own thing. But nobody in my family ever really collected. My cousins collected when I was a kid as well, but pretty much everybody I knew in the late 80s, early 90s was collecting. I mean, it was a big deal for a while there, that quote-unquote junk wax era. But there are a bunch of other things that I always appreciated, and I think I have a collector's mentality just in general. I always appreciate collections that people have. And so, for example, one of my passions along with sports is music. This is one of my old cassette tapes, Michael Jackson Thriller, one of my all-time favorite albums. When I was a little kid, he was my very favorite. I've got the Beatles magazine in the background because I'm a die-hard Beatles fan. Both of my parents love the Beatles, so I kind of grew up with them. Now, I did not like the Beatles when I was a kid. I would make arguments with my dad about how MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice were as good as the Beatles. It's just that the Beatles had a whole career, whereas my favorites only had a couple albums out. And, of course, that changed later on. So my favorite band of all time is Nirvana. And when Kurt Cobain said that the Beatles were great, then all of a sudden I agreed. But when my dad did it, I guess I just didn't think it was cool enough at the time. But yeah, big time Beatles fan now. And I actually collected these. I did a mail day video once and accidentally opened up one of these on the mail day. But this is kind of like chasing the rainbow for football cards. But these are limited edition cassette tapes of Bleach. And it's got the black, the blue, and the red versions. So I kind of feel like, very much inspired by those parallel cards. They had the parallel tapes. So that was a thing. And then for a while, when I was out of collecting sports cards, I did collect a lot of CDs and physical media. I collected movies and music and books. And so like this is an example with Tom Petty. Now with digital streaming, I really don't do it as much. It's more, if it's like one of my all-time favorites like Nirvana. But for the most part, the physical media has become limited. But I do collect occasionally vinyl records now. Not too often, but occasionally. So here's the Let It Be. This is one that I've had in my collection for many, many years. Love that one right there. And right here is another example. This Counting Crows. The band autographed this one for me. Adam Duritz right there. One of my favorite bands of the 90s up through now. And so a little bit of physical media in that way with the vinyl records. And a big part of this I was going to mention, with my parents, the reason I included them was my dad is a big-time Civil War buff. He's a big-time history buff in general. And he collected, and he doesn't really collect so much of this anymore, but for many, many years growing up, he collected Civil War items, and he would go to these gun collection shows and pick up stuff here and there, and so he really loved his Civil War collection, loved to show it off, loved to talk about it and the history of that. And I do think that carried over for me, where I wasn't so interested in the Civil War growing up as a kid, but I was interested in football, and so I started really liking the idea of the history of the game and the players, and I think that really did influence the way I collect. And my mom, same thing. She collected Madame Alexander dolls, and so while I was not into Madame Alexander dolls, I did appreciate that she liked to collect those and have a collection, and that it was something she enjoyed, and it's a very similar thing for me. And the other one I mentioned was my grandma, because she was a big-time book collector. And I think she really got me into that as well. I love books. I love to read. This is one of my all-time favorite series, Lord of the Rings. So I've got The Hobbit, Fellowship of the Ring, and The Two Towers, and Return of the King. But this is a really cool little mini edition of the series right here. And so that's another thing is, a collection of some of my all-time favorite books. And this one right here was pretty cool. This one was my dad's, and he gave this to me recently. But this one I was really impressed with. The Ken Burns Baseball and Illustrated History. So that's a gorgeous book with just some absolutely fantastic stuff in here. And again, this is an example of, combining, my dad's love of history with sports as well. And so that's a book that really means a lot to me. And this right here, my all-time favorite novel. It's a big book, but I love this book. Les Miserables, that is my favorite novel of all time by Victor Hugo. Plan to read it again one of these days. I've just adored this thing since I was about 20 years old when I first read it. But yeah, this is a big old book right there. So like I mentioned, my grandma was a big time book collector. For me as a kid, I wasn't very into books until Stephen King. He's the one who really got me into reading. And I really believe that if it weren't for Stephen King, I wouldn't have, fallen in love with a lot of really great literature, classics, a bunch of other stuff as well. So Stephen King is my all-time favorite author. I love him big time. And I do have a Stephen King collection that I've been working on since I was in junior high. And don't have everything, but I've got most. And so while my grandma B, when she would always say she loved to say knowledge is power and always encouraging reading. I don't know that she loved that I read Stephen King, but yeah, definitely my favorite author of all time. And again, really inspired me to get into other books as well. And I know a lot of people just think of Stephen King as horror, and of course there is a lot of that. I mean, you see a lot of it right here. But he did a lot of great stuff with like the fantasy, and some books that some people aren't really familiar with being his, like The Shawshank Redemption, Stand By Me, The Green Mile. So anyway, yeah, I don't have them all, but I've got a huge chunk of the Stephen King library that I continue to try to collect up to this day. And then last up, movies. Again, kind of like with CDs, just with streaming and the digital media of today, I don't really collect as much now. But I do collect a handful of things, and my favorite actor is Kevin Costner. He's been my favorite since I was a little kid, so I kind of grew up with his movies. So I do still collect his, just to get the full rundown. And yeah, so he's one that I've just loved, like I said, since I was just a little kid. And got everything that I can that's in physical media. He had a movie with Woody Harrelson that came out on Netflix that's not available. And a couple from like back in the day that aren't really available. But for the most part, that's pretty much everything right there. So again, I think that, my parents, my grandma, just having that collector's mentality, collecting the things they love, I think that really played off for me as well, and inspired me in my collecting endeavors. And so obviously I'd say since about 2013, my big hobby of, for collecting has gone back to sports cards. That's my real passion. But I'll still pick up any new Stephen King books. I'll still pick up anything from Nirvana or Kevin Costner or some of my all-time favorites. But for the most part, it's just that, But again, it's like whether it's collecting or hobbies, I love photography, I love hiking, I love going to concerts. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do out there that are more of a memory, and then there are also the things that are more tangible that can be nostalgic as well. And so, yeah, for me, I think I just kind of was raised in a family of collectors and people who, had a passion for certain things and like to collect those things. And I think that definitely rubbed off on me. My dad's love of history, my grandma's love of books. And I'd also add to that my mom. I mentioned this about my mom in a video in the past as well. But just the fact that she was so supportive of my siblings and I and our collecting and our love of sports. She would drive us to football practice. My dad was our baseball coach, so that was a big deal for us as well. But my mom would take us to the card shops, card shows. She would go to these giant card shows that we had back in the day where people like Emmitt Smith, after his rookie season, came out. So we got to meet Emmitt and get his autograph. Same thing with Barry Sanders a year earlier. Gale Sayers, Jim Plunkett. It was just so much fun to be able to do those things. And my mom had to really sacrifice time and energy to take us to those things. Never complained, always supportive. So, I just think, again, just a lot of great people. And then there are people in the hobby these days, the channels that I love. You guys know who you are, and that includes Zach and Porter, who inspire me just with that love of collecting and the love of the hobby. And so, yeah, that just kind of keeps it fresh and fun and engaging. And so, yeah, that's kind of, I wanted to do it a little different this time. I know it's not super sports card related. It's more just collecting as a whole, just because I feel like I had already talked a lot about, how I started collecting in the first place, but I think it's a great VR and I think it's a lot of fun. I'd be curious with you guys. Do you guys have any other collections along with football that you guys are passionate about or have been passionate about? And what kind of inspired you in your collections? Anyway, that'll be it for today. I want to thank Zach and Porter for the awesome idea for the VR, and congratulations on 400 subs. On to 500 next. Please check them out if you haven't already. And as always, go Bears.